Between 1939 and 1945, the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany became one of the defining features of the Second World War. Executed primarily by the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces, with significant contributions from across the Commonwealth. RAF Bomber Command and the USAAF's 8th Air Force employed differing tactics, the British flying night area bombing raids, and the Americans conducting daylight precision bombing. Despite doctrinal differences, the psychological pressures on their aircrews were remarkably similar. Whether over Hamburg by moonlight or in daylight raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Allied bomber crews faced extreme odds of death, grievous injury, or capture on every mission. Indeed, Bomber Command aircrews suffered a 44% death rate over the war, 55,573 killed out of 125,000, one of the highest casualty rates of any Allied service. American 8th Air Force bomber crews likewise endured heavy losses, especially before long-range fighter escorts became available in 1944. Beyond the British and American crews, the Royal Canadian Air Force made the largest contribution among the Commonwealth nations. By 1944, Canadians formed roughly 30% of Bomber Command's strength, serving both in No. 6 Group RCAF, a Canadian-administered group of 15 squadrons, and dispersed throughout other RAF units. Some 9,988 Canadian airmen were killed on Bomber Command operations. A staggering 58% of all RCAF Bomber Command personnel became casualties. Australians also served in large numbers, around 10,000 in Bomber Command, of whom more than 4,100 were killed. They had dedicated Australian squadrons such as numbers 460 and 467 RAAF, but many Aussies were mixed into RAF crews as well. New Zealanders, Polish and Free French also served under RAF operational control. Polish crews in particular were renowned for their determination, having personal scores to settle with the Nazis. As we will explore, combat stress among these men was not confined to moments of action. It was cumulative, progressive, and at times incapacitating. Flying in unpressurized aircraft at high altitudes, enduring anti-aircraft fire and enemy interceptors, and witnessing the deaths of comrades, many bomber crewmen developed symptoms we would now recognize as consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. This episode explores the psychological cost of the strategic air war on those who fought it from above, how sustained aerial combat affected cognition, morale, emotional resilience, and group cohesion across the Allied bomber forces. Unlike infantry, who often encountered combat spontaneously, bomber crews were subjected to a structured cycle of anticipation that created unique stress. Missions were scheduled in advance, and crews attended detailed briefings in the early hours for RAF night raids or pre-dawn for USAAF daylight raids. Intelligence updates, weather reports, and routes would be reviewed as crews studied the maps. Many veterans later recalled that these briefings themselves became a source of dread. Airmen would silently contemplate the losses from previous raids and the dangers of the upcoming one. For RAF Bomber Command crews flying at night, the long wait through daylight hours and then evening briefings heightened anxiety. American crews flying in daylight had the equally harrowing knowledge that once in the air, flak bursts and prowling enemy fighters would be plainly visible, making the danger feel immediate and inescapable. Psychologists today might term this cumulative pre-combat fear anticipatory trauma, an ongoing fear that builds up before each operation. Crewmen reported that the most stressful period was often not the fight itself, but the long hours of waiting and mental rehearsal beforehand. Each man understood the odds. In 1943, at the height of the air offensive, loss rates on some major raids were devastatingly high. For example, during Bomber Command's 1943-44 campaign against Berlin, nightly losses averaged around 5 to 8% of the attacking force, with some raids as high as 8 to 9%. Certain missions spiked even higher. The disastrous Nuremberg raid of 30 to 31 March 1944 saw 96 of 795 bombers shot down in a single night. Similarly, before long-range escorts arrived, the USAAF's daylight formations in 1943 suffered unsustainable losses. In the infamous August 17, 1943, Schweinfurt-Regensburg double raid, 60 out of 376 B-17 bombers were lost in one day, about 16% of the force. A few months later, in October 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt, the Black Thursday mission, saw another 60 B-17s shot down out of 291, over 20%. Each new sortie reinforced the sense that survival was largely a matter of luck. This persistent dread meant many crewmen went into combat already bearing the psychological burden of previous close calls and the rational calculation that their luck would eventually run out. Even once airborne, the tension did not abate until mission's end. Certain crew positions were especially exposed. For instance, Lancaster rear gunners sat alone in the tail turret, scanning the darkness for fighters. Geoffrey Payne, a rear gunner who beat the odds by flying 30 sorties, recalled the mindset bluntly: "I didn't expect to come back any time I went." George Cromarty, another Lancaster tail gunner, described how after landing, the first thing you did was light a cigarette and just sit there shaking. As the missions mounted, the cumulative psychological toll on aircrew became evident. British authorities coined a euphemism, lack of moral fibre, LMF, to label airmen who refused to continue flying due to stress or fear. This punitive designation, introduced in 1940, treated combat stress reactions as a kind of cowardice. An RAF airman officially labelled LMF would be stripped of his aircrew brevet, reduced in rank to aircraftman second class, and posted away to menial duties in disgrace. The intent was to deter weakness and remove stressed individuals from their comrades so as not to infect unit morale. In practice, the LMF policy often only added shame to those suffering what we now recognise as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress. The American forces took a slightly more clinical approach, using terms like combat fatigue or operational exhaustion by mid-war. US military psychiatrists in World War II identified a similar constellation of acute stress symptoms: trembling, nightmares and insomnia, emotional numbness or blunting, difficulty concentrating, startle reactions, and even dissociative episodes, a feeling of disconnection or unreality. Aircrew themselves had colloquial terms for those at the breaking point. For the Americans, it was flak happy. For the British, it was being cracked up or having the shakes. All of these referred to the same phenomenon: an individual who had mentally and emotionally hit the limit of what sustained combat stress they could handle. Medical officers observed that severe nervous and cognitive breakdowns tended to emerge after a certain number of missions. Many crews functioned relatively well for the first handful of operations, but as missions accumulated, signs of strain grew. In late 1942 and into 43, British doctors noted spikes in operational neurosis cases after about 8 to 15 missions in theatre. American studies similarly found that by the time an 8th Air Force bomber crew approached a dozen missions, many men showed marked fatigue, with only a minority statistically likely to complete the full 25-mission tour without incident. In fact, during 1943, only roughly 25% of US heavy bomber crews reached the 25-mission mark. The other 75% were lost to death, injury, capture, or removal for severe stress. The mid-tour period was especially perilous. Enough combat exposure for cumulative trauma to set in, but often still far from the finish line. Sustained operational flying placed enormous psychological strain on aircrew. Over time, many developed characteristic symptoms of combat stress, emotional numbness, impaired responsiveness, and episodes of detachment. In effect, some men coped by shutting down their emotional responses, at least temporarily, in order to continue functioning. While a few could endure repeated exposure and maintain outward composure, many experienced a gradual erosion of emotional stability and cognitive control. Today, we understand these symptoms as typical responses to prolonged trauma exposure, what clinicians now associate with flattened affect, diminished concentration, and memory difficulties resulting from chronic hyperarousal. The RAF's harsh LMF policy obscured these very real psychiatric injuries. Many aircrew who were near their breaking point continued flying out of a mix of internal loyalty and external pressure until they quite literally could not, at which point they might be quietly pulled from operations or worse, officially labelled LMF rather than treated with compassion. Compounding the stress was chronic sleep deprivation and physical strain. US bombing missions over Germany often lasted 6 to 10 hours in the air, and RAF night operations similarly kept crews awake all night. It was common for crews to have had only 2 to 4 hours of sleep before being roused for a night missions briefing, or to go more than 24 hours with no real rest during intensive operations. The physical environment in the bombers was itself punishing. crews flew in unpressurized, unheated aircraft at altitudes of 20,000 feet or more. Temperatures in a B-17 or Lancaster could drop to -40 degrees Celsius, inducing numb extremities despite thermal flight suits. Thin air at high altitude led to mild hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, if anyone's oxygen mask slipped, impairing cognition. Add to this poor nutrition, mess hall food and onboard rations were hardly optimal fuel, and the continual dump of stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, into the body, and it is no surprise that bomber airmen suffered impaired cognitive function over time. Wartime medical reports and crew diaries describe symptoms like impulsivity, irritability, tunnel vision, and even occasional hallucinations in the air, often attributed to fatigue or lack of oxygen. An RAF veteran of 50 missions reflected that by the end of a tour, you functioned en route, numb and running on nerves. In both the US and British forces, those who finally succumbed to severe combat fatigue were numerous. By one estimate, 5,000 to 6,500 RAF Bomber Command airmen were removed from duty for serious psychological disorders, and many more milder cases went unrecorded. The stigma, however, remained strong. A US bomber pilot noted that in his unit, the common term was flak happy, but we all sympathized because we knew we might be next. Similarly, RAF crews would say a comrade had cracked or gone tonto, acknowledging informally what the brass might call LMF. The operational impact was the same. An airman at the breaking point could jeopardize both himself and the crew, as split-second decisions and teamwork were essential in combat flying. Allied bomber crews functioned as closely bonded units, and this camaraderie was both a shield and a potential source of pain. An American B-17 Flying Fortress or B-24 Liberator crew consisted of 10 men, and a British Lancaster would have a crew of 7. These men trained together and flew together on every mission, typically in the same aircraft. Living, eating, and flying side by side forged intense bonds of trust. Veterans often described their crew as a second family. This unit cohesion was deliberately nurtured by military psychologists who recognized that strong crew morale could buffer individuals against fear. In practice, crews developed countless informal coping rituals and group habits. Many bomber crews adopted mascots or lucky charms, stuffed animals, a dog on base, a favorite flight jacket, etc. Dark or gallows humor was commonplace. Jokes about collecting flak holes or the awful food helped normalize the abnormal situation. Crews often had superstitions. Some always flew with the same mascot or wore the same article of clothing they considered lucky, and they might perform a particular pre-flight routine or prayer. These rituals and in-jokes provided a small sense of control and comfort amid chaos. Painting nose art on aircraft with witty or risque nicknames was another way to personalize the machine and boost morale. All these small unit-level practices helped airmen psychologically frame their experience in a way that was manageable, building resilience through camaraderie and shared purpose. However, the tight-knit nature of crews also meant losses hit hard. If a crew member was killed or badly wounded on a mission, his crewmates felt it like the loss of a brother. Such an event was often internalized as a personal failure. Surviving members might irrationally blame themselves for not preventing a comrade's death. If only I had spotted that fighter sooner. If we had flown a little higher. What we now recognize as survivor guilt frequently afflicted bomber crews, though the term was not yet in use. Veterans recalled that in squadrons with very high turnover, some airmen would emotionally distance themselves from new replacements, wary of getting close to men who might not be alive next week. A pilot from the US 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, admitted that after losing several good friends, I stopped learning the new guys' names until they'd made it through a few missions. Others coped by becoming hyper-vigilant, checking and rechecking their turret or engine or bomb site before every flight, or obsessively rehearsing emergency drills. While diligence was good, extreme hypervigilance was itself a symptom of stress, an outward sign of an airman's desperate desire to control the uncontrollable. If a crewman was lost, his position might be filled by a newcomer, but the empty bunk and chair in the mess were constant reminders. One RAF gunner described returning to barracks after a disastrous night. 2 beds were empty. We all sat in silence. The crew wasn't a crew anymore, just a few survivors. The loss of a crewmate thus cast a long shadow, and unit cohesion could waver as the remaining members processed grief, even as they had to integrate a new man and fly again within days. In sum, strong crew cohesion was a double-edged sword. It provided mutual support and collective bravery, but also meant that when a link in the chain broke, The psychological shock was profound. The Allied air forces tried to manage combat stress by implementing an operational tour system, a fixed number of missions to complete before aircrew were rotated off combat duty. In theory, this provided a light at the end of the tunnel and an incentive to persevere. For the USAAF in Europe, the standard tour was initially set at 25 missions. Famously, the Memphis Belle was one of the first B-17s to achieve this in mid-1943. However, as the air war intensified, 25 missions proved brutally hard to survive in 1943. So few crews made it that by March 1944, the USAAF raised the tour to 30 missions, and then in mid-1944 to 35 missions as escort fighters, and weakening German defences improved survival rates. Crews were often bitter about these increases, feeling the goalposts were being moved. Anecdotally, some joked the real goal was to keep raising the limit until everyone was dead or the war ended. The RAF Bomber Command tour was typically 30 sorties for a first tour. If one survived 30 operations, RAF aircrew were taken off bombing duty, screened, and usually given a rest posting as an instructor or in staff duties. Many hoped to finish their tour and not return to combat, but due to manpower needs, some were asked to volunteer for a second tour after a break, often a shorter tour of around 20 more ops. Very few aircrew undertook a third tour. The psychological effect of the tour system was significant. Crews kept a running count of missions completed and missions remaining. This mission countdown dominated squadron scuttlebutt. Airmen would compare their tally with others, calculate survival odds, and swap rumours. I hear they might count that last raid on a soft target as only half a mission. The hope of reaching tour's end gave many men something to cling to, but it was accompanied by dread as friends were lost along the way. In the hard years of 1943 to early 1944, completion rates were extremely low. For example, during the Battle of Berlin winter campaign of 1943 to 44, a bomber command crew had only around an 18% chance of surviving a full 30-mission tour intact based on loss rates. Statistically, most crews were shot down before 30 missions or suffered casualties that took them off duty. Those few who beat the odds were feted. The Memphis Belle's crew were sent home for a war bonds tour as national heroes. In RAF Bomber Command, crews that completed a tour were often given some celebrity, at least on base. They were the lucky old lags. However, the reality was that most bomber crews never lived to complete their tour or did so with injuries. One measure of how brutal the air war was. During 1943, the US 8th Air Force had to replace essentially its entire bomber crew roster about every 4 to 5 months due to losses and rotations. Those rare crews that did finish an operational tour intact were often emotionally and physically burned out. Post-war analyses by the RAF and US military medical services indicated that even among those who survived physically, many bore lasting psychological scars. Elevated rates of chronic anxiety, sleep disturbances, alcoholism and emotional detachment were reported anecdotally among ex-bomber aircrew in the late 1940s and 1950s. Few of these men received formal psychiatric help. Most simply tried to reintegrate into civilian life, often in silence, as the world moved on. It wasn't until decades later that PTSD in World War II veterans, including airmen, was truly acknowledged in medical literature. The World War II bomber war exposed these young airmen to intense and sustained combat stress in an era when psychological trauma was poorly understood. The symptoms they experienced, emotional numbing, nightmares and insomnia, hypervigilance, thousand-yard stares, breakdowns in functioning, clearly align with what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. At the time, however, such reactions were often attributed to personal weakness rather than injury. A British airman might be labelled LMF and shamed, an American might be pulled from combat for combat fatigue, but with limited follow-up. Few received meaningful psychological support or therapy by modern standards. The prevailing approach was to enforce rest or reassign the individual and hope time would heal the wounds. Unfortunately, many bomber veterans carried their mental scars silently for decades. Today, thanks to advances in neuroscience and psychology, we have a far deeper understanding of what chronic combat stress does to the human mind and body. Repeated exposure to life-threatening situations triggers continual activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response, along the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, flooding the body with stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine. Over time, this biochemical onslaught can disrupt memory processing, especially traumatic memories, sleep regulation, the immune system, and emotional control systems. In the brain, we now know that traumatic stress is associated with lasting changes in key areas. The amygdala, which governs fear responses, becomes overactive or hypersensitive. The hippocampus, involved in memory and context, often shrinks or shows impaired function, and the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and emotion regulation, exhibits decreased activity in those with PTSD. In short, chronic trauma rewires neural pathways, leading to hyperarousal, startle reactions, anxiety, intrusive memories, emotional dysregulation, and numbing, precisely the symptoms seen in countless World War II bomber crewmen. If military doctors of the 1940s had possessed this knowledge, they might have treated their airmen very differently. We can speculate that they would have recognized combat fatigue as a normal injury of war rather than a moral failing, and provided better intervention, such as prompt rest, counseling, non-punitive grounding for those in distress, unit-wide decompression periods after heavy operations, etc. Modern trauma therapy offers techniques that could have been invaluable to World War II aircrew. For example, Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains how the autonomic nervous system responds to threat and safety. Bomber crews were effectively locked in a threat state for months and could have benefited from techniques to down-regulate their nervous systems through breathing exercises, social connectedness, etc. Peter Levine's somatic experiencing approach emphasizes releasing trauma held in the body. One can imagine its application in helping airmen discharge some of the physiological tension after missions. Bessel van der Kolk, a leading trauma expert, underscores the importance of the body in trauma recovery. Had concepts like mindfulness, yoga, or EMDR been available in 1944, perhaps aircrew could have processed their fear and grief more effectively rather than bottling it up. But in the war years, the predominant ethos was the stiff upper lip and carrying on. Nonetheless, many veterans did eventually find ways to heal, or at least cope in post-war life, even if informally through talking with comrades or immersing themselves in peacetime routines. It is also worth noting that contemporary research highlights not only trauma's debilitating effects, but also the possibility of post-traumatic growth, positive psychological changes that can emerge from surviving adversity. Psychologists have found that some individuals, after enduring trauma, develop deeper insights into themselves, stronger relationships, and a changed life philosophy that values each day more. We can see hints of this in bomber crew memoirs. Many veterans later reflected not just on what the war took from them, lost friends, lost youth, nightmares, but also on how it shaped their character. Some spoke of a heightened appreciation for life and an enduring bond with their crewmates that felt more meaningful than any civilian friendship. Others found that overcoming the terror and hardship gave them a confidence in later life challenges. This resilience and growth did not negate the pain, but it shows the complexity of the human response to trauma. As one former RAF pilot put it 50 years later, we were different men after the war, more serious perhaps, but also more grateful for the life we got to live. Such perspectives underscore that with the right support, trauma need not spell the end of one's ability to function. For some, it can even be a foundation for renewed strength. The experience of World War II bomber crews under fire remains a powerful case study in human stress and resilience. The skies over Germany between 1939 and 1945 not only tested the limits of aircraft and tactics, but indeed the outer limits of human endurance. Young men were pushed into repeated life-or-death situations in a way few had been before, and they exhibited both remarkable bravery and very natural breakdowns. Importantly, the legacy of these bomber crew experiences has directly informed modern approaches to combat stress and mental health. To this day, military psychologists and flight surgeons study the lessons of Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force, from the value of crew cohesion to the necessity of rest rotations and honest acknowledgement of stress injuries. The men of Bomber Command and the USAAF paid a high price not only in lives, but in psychic trauma. By remembering and studying their ordeal, we gain not only historical perspective, but also a roadmap for providing better care to those who continue to fight in the skies today. Thanks for watching, and if you appreciate what we are doing, please subscribe and support us by checking out our merchandise shop.